I think in South Africa, you're going to hear from most CEOs pretty high up on their list. Probably the top two challenges are Transnet and Eskom. I think they're very public challenges for the mining industry. But I would add a third that I'm hearing a great deal around from CEOs and mining executives, which is what I would describe as the capability challenge, often called the skills challenge, but I think I would describe it as a capability challenge, perhaps less obvious, less public, but certainly one that we're experiencing and we're hearing mining executives talk about a great deal. Sure, it's in any role, any position, there are certain skills that are required, certain experience that is required to conduct that role effectively. Often tools as well required to do so. I think what we're seeing is that the capabilities, the skills, the experience, in some cases the tools, are not there where once perhaps they might have been, and so it's become a challenge for mining organisations to plug those capability gaps. Well, we have an improvement methodology that's very well proven, both in South Africa, across the rest of the continent, and indeed more internationally as well. That involves us looking at what we call ideas management, but essentially identifying and focusing on the main improvement opportunities and generating ideas or initiatives that would address those opportunities. It also involves us looking at what we call the wiring of the organisation, which simplified is simply driving the right behaviour, addressing the questions not so much of what we're going to do differently, but why the organisation would do it differently. And then the third leg to that improvement methodology is what we call capability. It is actually recognising that in order to improve, it may require certain individuals in parts of the operation, in parts of the management, to improve their ability to conduct their roles. What I think over certainly the last decade or so, what we've always assumed is a sort of background level of capability in the organisations that we're working in, and so we've focused very much on the ideas. We've focused very much on the wiring, and while we've worked on capability, we've always assumed, as I say, there's a certain background level that means that it's not necessarily been the most important thing that we work on in an organisation. Of late, maybe over the last few years, we've seen it come to the fore. We've actually begun to realise that we cannot assume that background level of capability anymore. It's not there. There's always a range in any particular role of those who are outstanding performers and those who are much less capable, and there's an average, there's a mean. But I think we've seen the mean drop in many key roles in the industry, and so that when we're working with a client, what we now find is we've got to lift that average before we start working on the ideas management and the wiring, driving the right behaviour. The first thing we've actually got to address is in fact capabilities, and often capabilities in particularly the frontline supervision roles, the shift boss roles, the foreman roles, the levels of management that maybe are not executive management. They're not artisans either. It's those frontline supervisors where we've seen a particular, I think, capability shift over the past few years and have to address it first before we start working on anything else. Well, maybe many years ago, I mean, the capability challenge is one that I think the mining industry has been speaking about. I joined the mining industry over 35 years ago, and when I joined, the industry was talking about a skills shortage. It's still talking about a skills shortage. It's not as if that's new. It's a difficult industry to recruit into. It's a difficult industry in which to retain folks. So that I don't think is necessarily new. I think perhaps there are greater opportunities for individuals elsewhere in the country now, and so maybe that's making it more difficult to recruit the right talent. But what the industry had those many years ago when I joined it was, for example, had mining houses. They had the industry had a number of very large companies that were able to invest in formal programs of not just training but mentorship to actually advance people through their careers. And I was only at a conference a couple of days ago where one very senior executive in our industry here mentioned his mentorship program, and that had helped him develop from a relatively junior level in the organisation to being somebody that became extremely prominent in our industry. And I think many of us benefited from those programs. With the demise of the mining houses, I don't think, and into a much more fragmented industry, I don't think the scale is there anymore to have those large programs. And therefore, I don't think that there is the same degree of training and coaching and mentorship. What's replaced it has been, in my opinion, less than adequate, which is a sort of a stance which is, we will train all of our frontline supervisors on something called management skills training, or something quite broad and generalised, and is almost a sort of a shotgun approach, or throw it out there and hope that it sticks to some people, which of course is really rather inefficient and ineffective. And we're certainly we're not seeing the results, positive results of those programs. I think a large amount of money is being spent on such programs, but we don't believe they're effective at all. So our stance on capability building, as I say, is actually to go in the other direction. So to continue my analogy, instead of a shotgun approach, a rifle shot approach. It's much more specific. So we believe that effective capability building requires, the first question to be answered is in what area, which capabilities? So which part of the operation is the one that is underperforming most and actually the result or causing most underperformance? Having identified that, well, which capabilities, which individuals and which capabilities are key to closing that gap? To then determine, okay, a very tailored or bespoke training program that says, right, let's build those capabilities in those individuals. So we might find ourselves training a dozen or so frontline supervisors, not 200 or 300, on certain skills gaps, certain tools perhaps, in order to lift their ability to do their job better. So far from being a shotgun approach, it's much more of a rifle shot approach, much more focused. And indeed, because we measure the impact of our training and the capability building, we know that it's much more effective because we're actually seeing the results. Well, as I say, the first thing we might look at is well, which part of the operation is a key opportunity to improve? What's letting us down, just operationally, without even looking at people yet? Which part of the operation? And so, if you took an underground mine, if you took an underground hard rock mine, for example, it might be, in many cases, many of the underground hard rock mines in South Africa have a challenge around what they call tip to face distance. So that is the distance from the face where the rock is broken to the point that it's actually tipped onto the ore movement infrastructure, and that's typically done by an LHD. If that distance is allowed to increase too much, first of all, it obviously reduces the production or productivity in the section because the LHD is having to travel a longer distance, and also because the LHD is not designed to travel long distances, it reduces the availability eventually of the LHD because the LHD breaks down because it's traveling too much. So minimizing tip to face distance is a really important KPI, key performance indicator, for an underground hard rock operation. We would look at that and say, okay, so what is the role of any particular individual in that, and why are we not minimizing the distance to the target level that we would want to? And quite often that, for example, we've just recently finished working with a client where that came down to the planning involved in moving the tip forward as the face advances, and finding that the shift boss that was responsible for that planning didn't have the necessary tools, and didn't have the necessary skills to do the planning properly. Therefore, when the tip was supposed to be moved, it wasn't, or when it was moved, it wasn't moved in the time that it should have been. There was a delay, and thus tip to face distances stayed at a level that was unacceptable. So what we did for those shift bosses was we gave them the tools to begin with, the planning tools to enable them to be much more organized around moving the tip. We trained them in the use of those tools. We coached them beyond that to ensure that the tools were being used effectively, so that eventually when we left that client, we had a team of shift bosses that knew exactly what they needed to do to plan a tip move. Meant that the planning was much better, meant that the tips were moved on time, meant that the tip to face distance was decreased dramatically, which of course meant production improved. Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're talking here about lifting individuals' abilities. We're talking about changing behaviour. That's not instant. It's not overnight. And I often worry if anybody ever suggests to a client that we might have that impact would be overnight. It simply doesn't happen that quickly. That training, that coaching, that reinforcement, it typically takes a few weeks, if not a couple of months, to get to a level of capability that is improved, the aspired level of capability, and then to sustain it probably takes a couple of months beyond that. But the client is typically seeing an improvement within a month or two. They're seeing, as it were, green shoots, which on that KPI that we might be measuring, and we spoke about tip to face, within a couple of months, but probably not completely sustained. In other words, if you pulled away all of the effort and attention that it was getting and said, okay, are we comfortable now that we will continue to operate at this improved level? Probably a couple of months beyond that, so 2 to 4 months before it's sustainable, but you're seeing results within a couple of months. I think I would leave a message which is that, first of all, it's addressable. As I say, I do hear a great deal from mining executives in various forms and messages, which is the skills gap, the skills shortage, the brain drain, and so on. I think that's a reality that the industry has to deal with, but I do think it can be addressed. I don't think it should be addressed through these large wholesale generalized training programs. We have simply just not seen the impact of those, much better addressed through a much more focused effort on the capabilities that are actually required in the areas that are most required, the improvement areas that are most required, and then track it and manage it, make sure that it is having the impact. But that, in our experience, is possible. It does have the impact, and so should give the industry some hope that that challenge can be addressed.